It was a small thing, really. The TV remote. Something I'd held in my hands every evening for 15 years, ever since Margaret passed and left me with nothing but silence and flickering screens to fill the hours. "You don't need the remote, Grandpa," Lisa said, reaching across me like I wasn't even there. Her voice had that tone, the one she used when explaining things to her 5-year-old. Patient, condescending. "We'll pick what to watch." She placed it on the top shelf of the bookcase, high enough that my arthritic fingers couldn't reach without a chair, high enough to make the point clear. This wasn't my house anymore, even though my name was still on something they'd never bothered to look for. My son David didn't even glance up from his phone. "Dad, you watch the same news channel every night anyway. We'll put it on for you." I didn't argue. What was the point? They'd moved in 6 months ago. Just temporarily, they said, while David looked for work and Lisa finished her degree. Temporarily had become permanently without anyone asking my opinion. My armchair became their footstool. My kitchen became their storage space. My quiet became their noise. But I remembered things they'd forgotten, or maybe things they'd never known. The remote wasn't about the television. It was about choice, about having some small corner of control in a life that had been steadily carved away piece by piece, decision by decision, until I was a guest in my own home. I excused myself and walked to my bedroom. They barely noticed. Lisa was already scrolling through streaming services, arguing with David about what to watch. Their voices followed me down the hallway, familiar sounds of a family that had learned to function around me rather than with me. In my bedroom, I opened the bottom drawer of my old oak dresser, past the moth-eaten sweaters and yellowed photographs. My fingers found the manila folder I'd placed there 20 years ago, the one I'd hoped I'd never need to open again. Inside were papers, important papers, papers that would change everything if anyone bothered to read them. I spread them across my bed cover and studied them in the lamplight. Every detail exactly as I remembered, every signature still bold and black, every date that mattered, documented and witnessed. Tomorrow, I decided, tomorrow I would remind them whose house this really was. From the living room came the sound of laughter. Lisa had found something funny on Netflix. They were comfortable now, settled in for the evening in what they believed was their space. But ownership isn't about who lives somewhere. It's about who holds the deed. And they were about to learn the difference. In the morning, I made my coffee the way Margaret used to, strong, black, no sugar. The kitchen felt different somehow, like I was seeing it through new eyes. Everything was still in the wrong place. Lisa's organic oat milk crowded my refrigerator shelf. David's protein powder cluttered my counter. Their dishes filled my sink. But today, none of it bothered me the way it usually did. I sat at the kitchen table with my folder spread open beside my coffee cup. The papers looked official in the morning light. Crisp, important, undeniable. I'd read them so many times over the years that I could recite them by memory, but seeing them again felt like meeting an old friend. The deed was dated March 15th, 2004. 20 years ago, next month. David had been 32 then, married to Lisa for 3 years, struggling to make ends meet on his substitute teacher's salary while she worked part-time at a dental office. They'd been renting a cramped apartment across town, talking about children they couldn't afford to have in a place barely big enough for 2. That's when Margaret got sick the first time. Cancer, the doctor said. Treatments, surgeries, months of uncertainty. We needed to be closer to the hospital, needed a place where she could rest, where I could take care of her properly. Our little house on Elm Street was too small, too far from everything. So I sold it. Took every penny from that sale, plus my retirement savings, plus a loan I'm still not sure how I qualified for, and bought this house. Put it in my name only. David was already drowning in student loans, and I didn't want to burden him with a mortgage he couldn't handle. It's for all of us, I'd told him when we moved in. Your mother needs the space, and you and Lisa need somewhere stable to build your lives. What I didn't say was that I'd planned for this to be our family home, a place where grandchildren might run through the halls someday, where holidays would happen around my dining room table, where Margaret and I would grow old together, surrounded by the people we loved. Margaret died 6 months later. The cancer came back faster and meaner than anyone expected. David and Lisa stayed for the funeral, then moved back to their apartment. We need our independence, Dad, David had said, but we'll visit all the time. The visits became monthly, then holidays only, then holidays when convenient, until 6 months ago, when David lost his job and Lisa decided to go back to school. Just temporarily, they'd said, until we get back on our feet. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Lisa's voice drifted down, cheerful and oblivious. The coffee smells good down there. I folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into the folder. Not yet. First, I wanted to see how far this would go, how much of my own house I was expected to surrender before they remembered who actually owned it. Lisa appeared in the kitchen wearing my favorite mug, the one Margaret gave me for our 20th anniversary. She'd found it in what used to be my private cabinet. "Morning, Grandpa," she said, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Sleep okay?" I nodded and sipped my coffee. The folder lay flat on the table beside my elbow, unremarkable as yesterday's newspaper. But everything had changed. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning brought a different energy to the house. I woke early, as I always did, but instead of lying in bed listening to the sounds of a family that had forgotten I existed, I got up with purpose. The folder was still on my nightstand where I'd left it, and seeing it there reminded me of what I'd decided. Today was the day they would learn who really owned this house. I made my coffee and toast, then sat at the kitchen table with the folder open beside my plate. The deed looked even more official in the morning light. 20 years old, but still crisp, still legal, still mine. I traced my finger along the property line description, remembering the day I'd signed these papers, the hope I'd felt then, the future I'd imagined for all of us. Margaret had been so excited about this house. "Look at all this space, Harold," she'd said, running her hands along the kitchen counters. "The grandchildren we'll have someday can run up and down these stairs. We can host Christmas dinner for 20 people if we want." We never got those grandchildren, never hosted that Christmas dinner. But the house remained, solid and patient, waiting for the family that never quite materialized the way we'd dreamed. I heard David's alarm clock through the ceiling. Soon the morning routine would begin. Lisa's shower, David's coffee, the quiet conversations about their day that never included asking about mine. I'd gotten used to being invisible in my own home, but today felt different. Today I had weight. behind my presence. David appeared first, hair messy, still in his pajamas. He grunted a greeting and headed straight for the coffee pot, not noticing the papers spread across the table. This was typical David, focused on his immediate needs, oblivious to anything that didn't directly affect him. "Morning, Dad," he said, pouring coffee into Margaret's anniversary mug. I watched him use it without thinking, the way he'd been using everything in this house without thinking, as if it all belonged to him by right rather than by my generosity. Lisa came down 10 minutes later, already dressed for her classes at the community college. She was studying to be a dental hygienist, a practical choice that would give them steady income once she graduated. I respected that about her, even if I didn't appreciate the way she'd taken over my home. "Good morning, Grandpa," she said, kissing the top of my head the way she always did. It was a sweet gesture, one that reminded me why I'd grown fond of her despite everything. But sweetness didn't change the fundamental problem we all faced. She noticed the papers immediately. Lisa was observant in a way David wasn't, attentive to details and changes in routine. "What are you working on?" she asked, sitting down across from me with her own coffee. "Just some old paperwork," I said, not lying exactly but not explaining either. "Nothing important." But that wasn't true, and we both knew it. Important papers had a certain look to them. Official seals, legal language, the kind of weight that came with consequence. These papers had all of that. David joined us at the table, scrolling through his phone while he ate cereal directly from the box. Another habit that would have driven Margaret crazy. Eating standing up, making crumbs on her clean floor, treating our kitchen like a convenience store. "I've got 3 interviews this week," he announced without looking up. 2 retail management positions and something at the insurance company downtown. This was progress. David had been out of work for 7 months now, living off unemployment and Lisa's part-time job at a photography studio. I wanted him to succeed, wanted them both to build the life they deserved, but I also wanted my own life back. "That's good news," I said, meaning it. If David found work, maybe they'd remember their promise to move out once they got back on their feet. Maybe I could reclaim my house without having to show them these papers. Lisa reached across the table for the sugar bowl, and her sleeve brushed against the corner of the deed. She glanced down, then looked at me with curiosity. "Is that a house deed?" she asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. David looked up from his phone for the first time that morning. I could feel both of them watching me, waiting for an explanation I wasn't ready to give. "Just old records," I said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Your grandmother always insisted we keep everything organized." It was another half-truth. Margaret had been organized, but she'd also understood the importance of these particular documents. She'd been the one who suggested we keep the deed in our bedroom rather than in the safe deposit box at the bank. "You never know when you might need quick access to something important," she'd said. "Banks have hours. Papers in your dresser drawer are available whenever you need them." Smart woman, my Margaret. She'd understood things about ownership and security that I was only beginning to appreciate. Lisa nodded and went back to her coffee, but I caught her exchanging a glance with David. They were curious now, maybe even concerned. Good. Curiosity was the first step toward understanding. After they left, David for his job interviews, Lisa for her morning classes, I remained at the kitchen table with my papers spread out again. The house felt different when I was alone in it. Quieter, but also more mine. Without their voices filling the air, without their belongings cluttering every surface, I could remember what it felt like to be the owner rather than the guest. I walked through each room slowly, seeing everything with new eyes. The living room, where Lisa had rearranged all the furniture to accommodate her study area. The guest bedroom that had become their permanent bedroom, complete with David's exercise equipment and Lisa's vanity table. The basement they'd turned into storage for all the belongings they'd brought from their apartment. Every room told the same story. Gradual takeover, slow erasure of my presence, steady transformation of my house into theirs. But transformation could work both ways. I had the power to remind them of the truth they'd forgotten or never fully understood. The question was whether I had the courage to use it. I returned to the kitchen and picked up my phone. There was a number I hadn't called in years, a person I hadn't spoken to since Margaret's funeral. But some conversations couldn't wait any longer. "Henderson Law Office," the receptionist answered. "This is Harold Mitchell," I said. "I need to speak with Bob Henderson about some property documents." Time to remind everyone who really owned this house. I scheduled the meeting with Bob Henderson for that afternoon. 20 years ago, he'd handled the purchase of this house, walking us through every document with the patience of someone who understood that for most people, buying a home was the biggest financial decision of their lives. Now I needed his expertise again, though for very different reasons. The law office hadn't changed much. Same wood paneling, same leather chairs, same smell of old books and fresh coffee. Bob looked older, grayer around the temples, but his handshake was still firm and his memory was still sharp. "Harold Mitchell," he said, settling behind his desk. "I was sorry to hear about Margaret. She was a lovely woman." "Thank you," I said, placing the folder on his desk. "I need to discuss the property we purchased in 2004. There have been some developments." Bob opened the folder and spread the documents across his desk, his experienced eyes scanning the familiar language. He'd drafted some of these papers himself, witnessed my signature on others. Everything was in order, had always been in order. "The deed is clear," he said after a few minutes. "Property is titled solely in your name. No joint ownership, no liens, no complications. What seems to be the problem?" I told him about David and Lisa, about the gradual takeover of my home, the assumption that they belonged there permanently, the small daily erosions of my authority, about the remote control and everything it represented. Bob listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with the same careful attention he'd given my documents. "You have absolute legal right to determine who lives in your house," he said. "The question is what you want to accomplish. Do you want them out immediately? Do you want rent? Do you want to establish clearer boundaries?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did I actually want? I'd been so focused on the injustice of the situation that I hadn't thought clearly about the outcome I hoped for. Did I want my son and daughter-in-law homeless? Did I want to destroy what remained of our relationship? Or did I simply want acknowledgement of the reality we'd all been pretending didn't exist? "I want them to remember who owns the house," I said finally. "I want decisions about my home to include me. I want to stop being treated like a guest in my own living room." Bob nodded, understanding immediately. "You want respect, not eviction." Exactly. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. I can draft a formal residential agreement, something that establishes your rights as owner while acknowledging their status as temporary residents. Rent, if you want it. House rules. A timeline for their departure once David finds employment. All legally binding, but fair to everyone involved. It was a perfect solution, official enough to make my point, reasonable enough to preserve family relationships. But something in my chest resisted the idea of lawyers and contracts and formal agreements. This wasn't about legal technicalities. This was about family, about respect, about remembering who we were to each other. Let me think about it, I said, gathering the papers back into my folder. Maybe there's another way. Bob walked me to the door, his expression understanding. Sometimes the most powerful legal document is the one you never have to use, he said. Just knowing it exists can change everything. Driving home, I thought about his words. The deed in my folder was powerful, not because of the legal language or official seals, but because it represented truth. David and Lisa had been living in a comfortable fiction for 6 months, pretending that my house was somehow theirs by default. But fiction only worked when everyone agreed to believe it. I parked in my driveway purchased with my money, maintained with my labor, and looked at the house I'd bought for my family 20 years ago. It was a good house, solid and welcoming, with room for the grandchildren Margaret had dreamed about, and space for the family dinners we'd never quite managed to have. Maybe it wasn't too late for either of those dreams. Inside, I found Lisa at the kitchen table, textbooks spread around her like a fort. She looked up when I entered, her face brightening with the genuine warmth that had always made me fond of her despite everything. "How was your day, Grandpa?" she asked, closing her anatomy textbook. "You were gone longer than usual." "Just some errands," I said, setting the folder on the counter. "How are your studies going?" We talked for 20 minutes about her classes, her upcoming exams, her plans for the dental hygienist program. She was smart and dedicated, working hard to build a career that would support their family. I admired that about her, even resented the way she'd taken over my space. David came home while we were talking, his face flushed with excitement. "I got the job," he announced, practically bouncing through the kitchen. "The insurance company. Full-time. Good benefits. Starts Monday." Lisa jumped up to hug him, both of them laughing with relief. 6 months of unemployment was ending. The financial pressure that had driven them to my house was finally lifting. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it completely. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Dad. And thank you for letting us stay here while I looked. I know it hasn't been easy having us underfoot." He said it casually, the way people acknowledge minor inconveniences. But the words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications none of us had fully examined. Underfoot. In my own house. I looked at my son, 32 years old, finally employed again, standing in the kitchen I'd bought with my retirement savings, and realized that he genuinely didn't understand what had happened here. He thought he was thanking me for temporary hospitality, not acknowledging 6 months of gradual displacement. "David," I said quietly, "this is my house." He blinked, confused by what seemed like an obvious statement. "Of course it is, Dad. We know that." But they didn't know it. Not really. They knew it intellectually, the way people know facts they never have to think about. What they didn't understand was what ownership actually meant, what rights came with having your name on a deed, what responsibilities came with living in someone else's home. I picked up the folder from the counter and set it on the kitchen table between us. 3 generations of my family gathered around furniture I'd bought in a house I'd purchased, looking at documents that would change everything. Maybe it's time we talked about that, I said. The conversation we should have had 6 months ago was finally about to begin. Looking at your previous request for Chapter 6, I can see you need a longer text with 10,000 plus characters. Let me write the final chapter with the proper length. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, as I had every day for the past 20 years. But this morning felt different. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months, the feeling of being displaced in my own home, had lifted sometime during the night, replaced by something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I made my coffee in the quiet kitchen, using my regular mug instead of searching for whatever Lisa had left available. The deed and mortgage papers were still spread across the kitchen table where we'd left them the night before, but they looked different now, less like weapons and more like what they'd always been: proof of a decision made with love, documents that represented hope rather than ownership disputes. David appeared first, still in his pajamas, but carrying himself differently than he had yesterday. There was something more thoughtful in his movements, more aware. He saw me at the table and paused in the doorway. "Morning, Dad," he said, and there was weight behind the simple greeting. "Mind if I join you?" I gestured to the chair across from me, the same chair where he'd sat yesterday while learning truths he should have known all along. He poured his coffee and sat down, both of us looking at the documents between us. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, "about what you said yesterday, about starting over. And I want to pay rent," he said firmly. "Lisa and I talked about it last night. We should have been paying rent from the beginning. This is your house, and we've been living here for free while you covered all the expenses." I studied my son's face, seeing determination there and something else, the beginning of the man I'd hoped he would become when he was younger: responsible, thoughtful, someone who understood that fairness wasn't just about legal rights, but about recognizing when someone had been generous and responding appropriately. "We can discuss that," I said. "But David, this was never about money. This was about respect, about remembering that we're family, not just people who happen to live in the same building." Lisa joined us then, already dressed for her morning classes. She moved more carefully than usual, aware of the space she occupied in a way she hadn't been before. Instead of automatically reaching for Margaret's anniversary mug, she took one of the plain white cups from the cabinet. "Good morning," she said, kissing the top of my head as she always did. But this time, the gesture felt different, more intentional, more grateful. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," I answered honestly. She sat down beside David, both of them looking at me with the kind of attention I hadn't received in a long time. Not the polite, distracted acknowledgement I'd grown used to, but real focus. The way family members look at each other when they're trying to rebuild something important. "We made a list," Lisa said, pulling a piece of paper from her pocket, "of things we want to change, ways we want to show respect for your home and your generosity." She unfolded the paper and placed it on the table beside the legal documents. I could see David's handwriting mixed with hers, items crossed out and rewritten, additions made in different colored pens, the evidence of a long conversation held late into the night. First, David read, we want to pay fair market rent, starting with my first paycheck. We looked up comparable properties online, and we think $400 a month is reasonable for the guest room and shared common spaces. It was less than they would pay for any apartment in town, but it was a start. More importantly, it was an acknowledgment of the financial burden they'd placed on me without considering it. Second, Lisa continued, we want to establish house rules that respect your ownership. No major changes without discussion. No rearranging furniture without asking. No assuming we can use things that belong to you without permission. I thought about Margaret's anniversary mug, about my favorite chair that had become their footstool, about the remote control that had started this whole conversation. Small things that had represented larger losses. Third, David said, we want to schedule regular family dinners. Not just eating in the same room, but actually sitting down together and talking like a real family. This one made my throat tight. Margaret had always insisted on family dinners when David was growing up, but that tradition had died with her. We'd gotten out of the habit of being intentional about our relationships, letting them drift into casual coexistence rather than nurturing them actively. And fourth, Lisa finished, we want to help you make this house feel like home for all of us. Maybe paint some rooms, fix things that need fixing, plant a garden in the spring. Not because we're taking over, but because we want to contribute to making this a place we're all proud to live in. I looked at their list, then at their faces, seeing the sincerity there. These were good people who had lost their way temporarily, who had forgotten that living with family required different skills than living on your own. But they were ready to remember, ready to do the work that real relationships required. There's one more thing, David said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the TV remote, the same remote Lisa had placed on the high shelf yesterday, the small object that had triggered this entire confrontation. This belongs to you, he said, placing it in my hands, along with the decision about what we watch and when we watch it. We're grateful to be here, and we want to act like it. I held the remote, feeling its familiar weight, remembering all the evenings I'd spent holding it while Margaret sat beside me on the couch, choosing programs we both enjoyed. It was just a piece of plastic and electronics, but it represented something larger, the right to make choices in my own home, the authority that came with ownership, the respect that should exist between family members. Thank you, I said, and meant it completely. No, Lisa said, tears starting again. Thank you for buying this house in the first place, for letting us stay when we needed help, for being patient with us while we figured out how to be better family members. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, 3 generations of the same family learning how to be together again. Outside, the sun was rising over the neighborhood I'd called home for 20 years, casting long shadows across the yard I'd maintained and the driveway I'd shoveled every winter. David left for his first day at the new job with a kiss on my cheek and a promise to pick up groceries on his way home. Lisa gathered her textbooks with careful hands, making sure she left the kitchen table clear for my use during the day. Both of them moved through the house like people who understood they were guests in someone else's space. Not unwelcome guests, but family members who had remembered their manners. After they left, I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. The living room where Lisa had rearranged the furniture actually looked better than it had before. She had a good eye for design, and the new layout made better use of the space. The guest bedroom they'd claimed showed signs of careful maintenance. They'd been taking good care of my house, even if they'd forgotten whose house it was. In the basement, I found David's exercise equipment arranged neatly in one corner, Lisa's craft supplies organized on shelves they'd installed themselves. They'd made improvements, added value, treated the house like a home rather than just a place to sleep. They'd just forgotten to include me in the process. But that was changing now. The conversation we should have had 6 months ago had finally happened, and everyone understood their role better. I was the owner, but ownership came with responsibilities as well as rights. They were family members who needed temporary help, but family membership came with obligations as well as benefits. I spent the afternoon organizing the legal documents, putting them back in the folder, but leaving the folder on the kitchen counter where anyone could see it. Not as a threat, but as a reminder. These papers represented 20 years of sacrifice, 20 years of hope, 20 years of building something for the people I loved. When David came home from his first day of work, his face was bright with the satisfaction of employment, of purpose, of moving forward again after months of uncertainty. When Lisa returned from her classes, she had the focused energy of someone building toward a goal, creating a career that would support their family's future. We made dinner together that night, really together, all three of us in the kitchen at the same time, talking and laughing and getting in each other's way in the best possible way. Lisa used one of the plain white mugs for her coffee. David asked before turning on the television. I chose the channel, but asked what they wanted to watch. Small gestures, but they added up to something larger. Respect, gratitude, the recognition that we were family members with different roles, but equal value. Later that evening, as we sat in the living room watching the news together, I held the remote loosely in my hands. It was just a small piece of plastic, but it represented something important. The right to make choices, the authority that came with ownership, the respect that should exist between people who love each other. Margaret would have liked this, I thought. She would have been proud to see our family learning how to be a real family again, to see her house becoming the home she dreamed it could be. Tomorrow, David would go to his job and Lisa would go to her classes, and I would spend the day in a house that felt like mine again. But more than that, I would spend it in a home that belonged to all of us, not because of legal documents, but because we were choosing to build something together, choosing to be the family Margaret had always believed we could become. The remote sat in my hand, but it was no longer a symbol of control. It was a symbol of choice, the choice to forgive, to rebuild, to remember that love and respect could coexist with authority and ownership. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began immediately. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Lisa quietly preparing breakfast in the kitchen, not just for herself, but for all three of us. When I came downstairs, I found the table set with 3 place settings, orange juice poured, and the smell of bacon filling the air. "Good morning, Grandpa," she said, turning from the stove with a smile that looked different somehow, more grateful, more aware. I thought we could start having real breakfasts together, as a family. David appeared moments later, already dressed for his second day at the new job. His face held the satisfaction of employment, but also something deeper. the look of a man who had remembered his responsibilities and was ready to embrace them. "Morning, Dad," he said, sitting down at what had always been his place at the table. "I've been thinking about what you said, about this being your house, but also being our family home." Over breakfast, we began the real work of rebuilding our relationships. Not the dramatic conversation of the day before, but the smaller daily negotiations that make families function. Who would handle which household chores? How we would share grocery expenses? When we would schedule the family dinners Lisa had proposed. "I want to paint the guest bedroom," Lisa said, spreading jam on her toast. "The walls are looking tired, and since we're going to be staying for a while, I'd like to make it feel fresh, but only if you approve the color choice." 6 months ago, she would have simply bought paint and started rolling it on the walls. Now, she was asking permission, not because I demanded it, but because she understood that respect required intention, not just good wishes. "I'd like to see the color samples," I said, "and maybe we could paint the hallway too while we're at it. It's been needing attention for years." David pulled out his phone and made a note. "I can pick up supplies this weekend, and Dad, I want to fix that loose step on the front porch. It's been bothering me every time I walk up it, but I kept forgetting to ask if you wanted me to handle it." These were small things: paint, household repairs, shared meals, but they represented something larger, the recognition that we were building something together, not just coexisting in the same space. After they left for work and school, I spent the morning walking through the house with new eyes. The living room where Lisa had rearranged the furniture actually looked better than it had before. She had a good eye for design, and the new layout made better use of the natural light from the windows. In the guest bedroom, I could see the care they'd taken with my belongings, the way David's clothes were neatly hung in the closet, how Lisa's cosmetics were organized on the dresser without cluttering it. They had been good tenants, I realized. They had maintained my house, improved it in some ways, treated it with respect. What had been missing wasn't care for the property. It was acknowledgement of who owned it, gratitude for the generosity that made their presence possible. But that was changing now. I spent the afternoon organizing my own spaces, reclaiming small territories that had been gradually absorbed into their lives. My desk in the corner of the living room, where I'd stopped working on my crossword puzzles because Lisa needed the space for studying. The cabinet in the kitchen, where I kept my special tea, which had been pushed aside to make room for their health supplements. Not with anger or resentment, but with the quiet satisfaction of a homeowner putting his house in order. When David came home from work, he found me in the basement, sorting through boxes of Margaret's things that I'd been avoiding for months. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, taking in the scene, opened boxes, carefully sorted piles, the evidence of a man finally ready to face his grief. "Can I help?" he asked quietly. We spent 2 hours going through Margaret's belongings together, father and son, remembering the woman who had brought us together in the first place. David found photo albums I'd forgotten existed, pictures of him as a child, family vacations, holidays around the kitchen table upstairs. "She really loved this house," he said, looking at photos of Margaret in the garden, standing in the kitchen, decorating the living room for Christmas. "She made it feel like home." "She did," I agreed, "and she always hoped it would be filled with family. Not just people living in the same building, but real family. People who chose to be together. When Lisa came home from her evening classes, she found us in the living room, photo albums spread across the coffee table, sharing stories about Margaret that David had never heard before, memories that connected all of us to the woman who had made this house a home in the first place. "Tell me about when you first bought this house," Lisa said, settling beside David on the couch. "I want to understand what it meant to you and Margaret." So I told them about those early days, the excitement of house hunting, the careful budgeting, the dreams we'd had for the space, about Margaret's plans for the garden, her vision for holiday gatherings, her hope that someday grandchildren would run through these halls. "She used to sit right there," I said, pointing to the chair beside mine, "and plan out how we'd arrange furniture when you and Lisa came to visit with children. She had names picked out for rooms, the Little Prince's room and the Little Princess's room. She was so sure that someday this house would be full of the family we'd always wanted." Lisa was crying again, but quietly, the kind of tears that come with understanding rather than guilt. "We could still have that," she said. "Maybe not exactly the way she imagined, but we could still be the family she hoped for." David reached across the space between us and squeezed my shoulder. "We want to be that family, Dad. We want to honor what she dreamed about." Over the following weeks, our daily routines shifted into new patterns. David left for work each morning with a kiss on my cheek and a promise to call if he was going to be late for dinner. Lisa studied at the kitchen table but cleared her books away before meals, asking about my day, sharing stories from her classes. They paid their first month's rent with a ceremony that felt more significant than the money involved. David handed me the check formally, shaking my hand like we were closing a business deal. But the real meaning was in Lisa's hug afterward, in her whispered, "Thank you for everything." The house began to feel different, not because the physical spaces had changed dramatically, but because the emotional dynamics had shifted. I was no longer an afterthought in my own home, no longer someone to be worked around or accommodated. I was the owner, the patriarch, the person whose decisions carried weight because they came with responsibility. But more than that, I was family again. Not just the old man who happened to live in the same building, but someone whose presence mattered, whose opinions were valued, whose comfort and happiness were considered in the daily choices that make up domestic life. One evening in November, as we sat around the dinner table sharing our days, Lisa made an announcement that surprised all of us. "I've been thinking about what I want to do after I finish my dental hygienist training," she said, "and I want to stay here, not just in this house, but in this town. I want to find a job at one of the local practices and build a life here." David looked at her with surprise. "I thought you wanted to move to the city once you graduated. Better opportunities, higher pay." "I did think that," she said, "but I've realized something over the past few weeks. Home isn't about opportunities or money. It's about being with people who love you in a place where you belong." She looked at me across the table, her eyes bright with certainty. "This feels like home now, real home, and I don't want to leave that behind for anything." It was David who asked the question we were all thinking. "Does that mean you want to stay here permanently? In this house?" The conversation that followed lasted past midnight. We talked about the future, about their plans and my hopes, about what it would mean for three adults to share this space long term. not as a temporary arrangement born of necessity, but as a chosen family structure built on mutual respect and genuine affection. By the time we went to bed, we had reached an understanding. They would stay as long as they wanted to, but as contributing family members rather than dependent guests. We would renovate the basement into a proper apartment, giving them privacy while keeping us connected. We would share expenses, responsibilities, and decision-making in ways that honored both my ownership and their investment in our shared home. Most importantly, we would continue the work of being a real family, not just people who happened to be related, but people who chose each other daily, who supported each other's dreams, who built something together that was stronger than any individual could create alone. That night, as I prepared for bed in the house I'd bought 20 years ago with such different dreams, I realized that Margaret's vision was coming true after all. Not exactly as she'd imagined it, but in ways that honored her hopes for our family. The house was full of love again, full of respect and gratitude, and the daily choice to be better to each other than we had to be, full of the sounds of family life, conversations at dinner, laughter in the evening, the comfortable silence of people who belong together. And on my nightstand, in the drawer where I'd kept them for 20 years, the legal documents that proved my ownership rested quietly beside Margaret's jewelry box and our wedding photo. Still important, still legally binding, but no longer the most significant thing about this house. The most significant thing was what we were building together. A home where everyone belonged, where everyone contributed, where everyone remembered that love and respect made better foundation than legal documents or family obligation. Margaret would have been proud. And finally, after months of doubt and displacement, so was I.